welcome to My Life with Robert Burns, our video podcast, where we talk to cronies from around the Burns world about their interest in Burns and a little bit about their life. Douglas Mackenzie here with Jim Thompson, my friend and colleague. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Douglas. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Today, our guest is a former president of Airdrie Burns Club, and he's an author and compiler of several books. Cronies everywhere. Please welcome David Westwood.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thanks for asking me to come along and speak tonight. I've really been looking forward to this. I watched the first Bachelors Club meeting. I attended that last month, and I'll speak a wee bit about that later on as well, but absolutely fantastic.
Well, thanks for that, David. You'll know that we always start off these podcasts with the same simple question. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
No problem. Well, my name's David Westwood. I was born in a wee town outside Glasgow called Coatbridge. Coatbridge. There's not really a lot you can tell about Coatbridge. It was hit by a hurricane last year and did £10,000 worth of damage or improvement. Not the point. I went to school. I went to St Bernard's School. That was a primary school I went to. Not much I can say about that, other than it was quite an unusual experience. When I went to school, I was left-handed and left-footed. But when I went to St Bernard's, they encouraged pupils from writing with their left hand, and they wanted you to write with your right hand. Now, very strange, but it seems to be this way in most Catholic schools at the time when I was there. That's what they did. You were considered to be possessed if you wrote with your left hand. Silly, I know, but that's just the way these things go. We had a fairly good life. I've got one brother and one sister. We grew up together and stayed in Coatbridge all our lives.
You stayed in Coatbridge all your life? Does that mean that you were an Albion Rovers supporter?
No, strangely enough, I'm not a football supporter at all. It's really a game that I've never really taken to at all. In fact, I wouldn't say I'm very sporty minded at all. I prefer reading, I prefer researching, I prefer writing. I like an occasional game of golf, but when I say occasional, it is occasional. And I like watching the rugby. But football, I've not really had much time for it, and especially in Coatbridge and Airdrie around that area. A lot of the times it was just an excuse for a fight, typical Scotland, you know, depending on the team you supported.
And what subjects did you do at school?
The vast majority of subjects that everyone does, you know, but I preferred biology. I loved biology. I liked French. French was good. English. I liked English, but funny enough, I wasn't really into the English grammar in a big way, but I liked reading about William Shakespeare, and I liked reading about Wordsworth, all these people. Burns didn't really come into the curriculum at all. I mean, when you were at school, I mean, they did have a Burns Day, which was on the 25th of January. That was all you got. And even then, it would just be somebody reading Tam O'Shanter, which in those days, people tended to drift quite a lot while they were listening to it. So the reciter wasn't really given that much support while he was doing it. But very little in the way of Burns.
And what did you do after school?
Now, after school, I left school at 15, and I'd always wanted to be a policeman. But the problem with that was that I was 5'8", and in Scotland at the time, they were not accepting people unless you were 6 foot tall. You had to be a big bobby. I managed to find a constabulary in England, the Wiltshire Constabulary. It's just behind Devon and Cornwall, you know, kind of place near the bottom. and they were taking people at 5'8". So I wrote to them thinking, it's miles away, I'm never going to get accepted. But they wrote back saying that they have single men's accommodation. They can put me up, and it was called Golden House in the middle of the police building. And that's where the cadets and the trainee police officers lived during their training. I stayed there basically Monday through to Sunday, and the only time I came home was long holidays like Christmas, New Year, Easter. But Mondays to Fridays were very good because you'd all your colleagues, we all lived in. But on the weekends, they went home and I was left in there was a big house that held maybe 200 people. And I was left in there myself. Occasionally, a couple of the Welsh guys wouldn't go home because it was too far for them to travel. So that was it. You were left alone a lot of the time, and just the weekends you had to make up yourself doing things. And as I say, I liked reading, and I developed a fascination for Scottish history at that time. So I started to read things about Scottish history. Burns wasn't the first thing I picked up, but it was things like Wallace, Bruce, things like that. And we started to read them, and I enjoyed doing that, and that certainly passed a lot of the time for me. After 3 years, well, I started to get homesick after about 2.5 years. But I spoke to my training sergeant, and he talked me out of leaving. He thought it would be better if I stayed the full 3 years, completed my cadetship. He says, that way we can let you walk away with a good reference. And I have to say that the reference I got from the chief constable there was an amazing reference. It would have got me through the gates of heaven. But I got a funny story about that time when I was down there. As cadets, the chief constable at that time was George Glendenning, or Sir George Glendenning as he's now known. And he was very pally with Prince Philip. And he used to go in the grouse shoots together. And I remember he would he would get the cadets to come along and do the grouse beating. And we were all lined up at the end one day, and they were coming along just thanking us. And he brought Prince Philip along, and he introduced Prince Philip to me. And he said, this is a Scottish cadet I was telling you about. And he just kind of nodded, the way he was. And I said, I shouldn't have said this because I was supposed to be quiet. But I said, I've got a wee house in Scotland. That's where I live. And he says, well, I've got a wee house in Scotland as well. It's called Balmoral Castle.
Aye.
That was my first time meeting royalty.
So
a nice man. He was nice.
So he was just talking about a wee button bend they had up north.
Aye. Then after that, I came home. I wasn't unemployed for long because the big major hospital in North Lanarkshire started to open its doors. And by open its doors, it was literally open its doors. It was moving furniture in and out to get it set up. So I applied for a job there as a theatre technician, which was a good job. It was involved setting up the theatres before operation, positioning patients on the table for the different operations you were going through. It was a 7-year apprenticeship to complete the course. So I started doing that, thoroughly enjoyed that. That was a great thing. And then I realised, despite being such a good job, I could actually make more money working as a porter in the hospital, which was strange. But so I transferred from my training, my theatre training, went into the porters, worked 2 years there. And while I was working at the porters, I got to talk to a lot of the nurses. And they kind of talked me into going on and doing a nursing career. So I applied for a job at the local psychiatric hospital, which was Gartlock at the time, big major psychiatric hospital in Glasgow. I got accepted there to do my enrolled nurse training, which is a 2-year course. As opposed to being a staff nurse, you were an enrolled nurse. I stayed there for 15 years, and that's really where Burns started to come into my life, because I formed a wee band with one of my friends, Andrew Smith, and we used to go around the wards. Because I stayed in a nurses' home, we never went home. We used to go around the wards at night time and play to the patients. So we would use a lot of Corey's material, and a lot of that involved a lot of Burns's stuff. So that's what we did mainly during the nights. We entertained the patients, we went round all the wards and played their songs.
Very good. Did the band have a name?
Yeah, we were called Sheerlack, which is Gaelic for Charlie.
Oh, right.
Gatlock closed 15 years later, and that was one of the major psychiatric hospitals in Glasgow which closed down. Now, they didn't want to pay everyone off, so they gave us an automatic transfer, and basically to anywhere we wanted. Now, because I was trained as a general nurse, rather than moving into the psychiatric sector, they advised me to move into the community. And that's where I worked from the community from, say, 1996 onwards. I'm sure it was right about then. I might have the dates mixed up. But there I went on to do my degree in nursing, where I did an adult nursing degree and specialised in palliative care, which is basically just care of the terminally ill. I then went on to complete my registered general nurse training, which was to become a staff nurse. And then I moved into the community in Glasgow itself, where I worked really between three places. I was in Springburn, which is quite a rough area in Glasgow. It's not bad. I then moved to Bridgeton. Now that's an eye-opener, Bridgeton. And then actually moved out to the West End in Glasgow. Again, another eye-opener. Met a lot of famous people during my nursing. Brought Burns into their life. I always used to walk about a wee book. If I can just show you. This is a wee book I used to walk about with now. It's a bit tattered and torn. It's held together by sellotape. Now, I took this everywhere with me in my nursing. It was kept in my front pocket. And for nearly 25 years, I walked about with this book in my pocket. And it used to, I'd have the top end sticking out, obviously. And the amount of times patients commented on it, I'll give you a story later on about that, was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. The average age of the person that I dealt with was 60 to 90. And most of them were all aware of Burns, and they were all professionally educated academic people. So we exchanged a lot of ideas in Burns as patients and nurse together. It was a kind of therapy.
Yeah.
I would go into one old woman in particular who was a school teacher. And she used to say to me, "Do you know Tamashanta?" Now, this was women I should have been visiting for cancer support. And I would say, "Yes, but I'm not here to do that. I'm here to give you some support in your illness." And she would go, "I would rather hear Tamashanta." So that was me. I would have to just stop what I was doing. I would sit down and I'd sit in that woman's house for an hour reciting Tamashanta and talking about Burns in general. And then when I went back to the office, my manager would say, "Oh, you were in at Mrs. So-and-so. How is she today?" I went, "I think she's fine." And she would go, "What do you mean you think she's fine? Did you check her all out?" I says, "Well, I checked her out visually. I says, as far as I'm concerned, she looks okay. Her body language is fine." But all she wanted to do was sit and talk about Burns. And my manager says, "Maybe the next time go in and try something." Well, she says, "I'll go in and do it the next visit." So the manager went in, did the next visit. She came back out and she says, "Davy, you're back on again. You're back in once again." He doesn't want us. She just wants you to come in and do your burn stuff.
Well, but before we move on to Burns completely,
Mhm.
you want to tell us anything about your family, or do a bit of name dropping?
Yeah, I've got my brother's Jim. He's the oldest in the family. He's in his 70s now. My sister's June. She's a year older than me. I have two daughters, Fiona and Mary, both good looking. Thank God my wife cheated on me.
Oh dear, oh dear. Okay, you almost got us started in Burns there, talking about one of your patients and her interest in Burns. But I'll pass on to Jim now to get you talking for real about your interest in Burns.
Okay, no.
David, how did you get started with Burns?
Back when my first encounter with Burns, as I say, was not in the schools. It should have been, but it wasn't. Back when the Monklands Hospital phone first opened, I became friendly with one of the pharmacists here, and we decided to form a social club, in the hospital. And we ran things like skiing, we ran things like hill walking, we did plays for the patients. And then one night we decided to do a burn supper. Now, none of us had any clue what to do with the burn supper. So I ended up having to do the immortal memory, which for someone who doesn't even know anything about burns was just it was just unheard of. But nobody else wanted to take on the job. So we held our first burn supper. I looked at a lot of burn speeches, and again, because I wasn't familiar with burns, I really basically cut and pasted a lot of these speeches together to form an immortal memory. The big no-no in our circle, as you know. But that's what I did. And we had a consultant orthopedic surgeon doing the toast to the lasses. And we had all the other guests doing the reciting and everything else. And the night actually went down really, really well. So much so that people were asking if we're going to have a second one. And I decided then, I quite like this. I would like to do more about it. So what will I do? And the first thing that came to my mind is, well, Airdrie has a very big burns club. It's a very old burns club. I think it's in the single figures in the federation, but very old. And I went along and I filled in a membership for them, and I got accepted. And I started to go to the burn suppers, and well, Airdrie doesn't call them burn suppers; they call them burns dinners, because, to be honest, they seen the burns dinner as being a more academic burn supper, if you know what I mean by that. So they were very careful who they got to do the speakers. There wasn't a lot of joviality in the speeches. It was kept very basically to an academic level, talking about burns, talking about the lasses. It was an all-male club. It still is an all-male club. So we didn't have a reply from the lasses, but everything was very academic in the way it was delivered. Now, at times, if you didn't know or you didn't have some background knowledge in burns, that could be a bit confusing trying to follow that. So after being at a couple of suppers, I decided, no, I'm going to really get into burns and learn a wee bit more about them. And I said, what's the best way to do that? So I said, well, get some books, read some books. I think that's the best way to start. And then I was at a burns supper, which was a burns supper in a bowling club. And this man was there, his name was Ronnie Wilson. And it just popped up on the floor in the middle of the burns supper. to do a rendition of Tam O'Shanter. Now, Ronnie actually, as well as doing Tam O'Shanter, dressed as Burns, and he had the good blue breeks, you know, he had everything made in 17th century style clothing. And he was absolutely, it was astounding listening to him. It's certainly one of the best Tams that I've heard. And I've heard a few of them in my time. It was there wasn't a lot of comedy in it at all. It was more kind of acting as Burns. And I said to myself, you know, I like that. I wonder if I could learn Tam O'Shanter. And then I could start off, you know, maybe get myself into the Burns circuit. And my mate said, forget about it. It's not worth your while, because if you're invited to a Burns supper, you're not only expected to do Tam, but you're expected to do Holy Willie and the address to the haggis, especially in North Lanarkshire. The person that usually does the other things as well. You know, so it's a case of learning all three. So I said, well, fine, I'll learn the address to the haggis. That's the shortest one. So I sat down, I learned the address to the haggis. I practiced on my wife, so she can virtually say it verbatim. I then went on, and Holy Willie was the next one. That was the next shortest. And then I went on to do Tam. And it was only when doing Tam, I mean, I've listened to people doing Tam before this. It was only when I actually started memorising the poem that I actually realised what Tam O'Shanter was about. Because as you're listening to it, you lost track of it when someone goes from the beginning to get to the end of it. And I started it was this book again. I said, I'll learn it from this book. In fact, I learned all my poems from this book. Because one of the problems I noticed when I was researching Tam O'Shanter to recite it was, I mean, this particular book here contains 3 lawyers' tongues turned inside out, with lies seems like a beggar's flute. 3 priests' hearts rotten black as muck, like stinking bile in every nook. Now, as you know, that verse was taken out of the original Tam O'Shanter because one of Burns's friends had said that it's not a good idea to criticise lawyers, and it's not a good idea to criticise the clergy either. Which I found quite strange, because 2 of Burns's greatest friends, Gavin Maxwell and Bob Aitken, Orator Bob, were both lawyers. In fact, the first edition, the Kilmarnock edition, is dedicated to Gavin Hamilton. So why Burns would say something like that about lawyers? I know he had run-ins with factors, but I did a bit of research. This is kind of stemming on from all the things I'm doing. And I find the only bad letter Robert Burns got from a lawyer was one near the end of his days, where he received a lawyer's letter from the haberdasher that he owed the money for his Dumfries volunteer suit. And that was the only bad letter I could find. And it was the same with the ministers. You had McMath, you had Cannon, you had Russell, you had all these fire and brimstone ministers. But and as you all know, that Burns preferred the new lists as opposed to the old lists. But again, I looked at this, and I couldn't understand why Burns felt that way about them, because it wasn't so much the ministers Burns didn't like. It was the hypocrisy associated with it and the other people involved. I mean, I don't think he had a bad word to say about Daddy Old, not that I've come across anyway. I mean, he said, I mean, when he had to do his time in the cottage stool, he done it, and he was quite happy to do it. But as I did each one of these poems, I started to do a bit of research into all the things associated with them. And then I became involved in the Burns scene itself, where I actually started going around and doing the reciting. And I felt, this is really good. I'm really enjoying this. I mean, okay, I'm having to do 3 poems. Fantastic. Thoroughly enjoyed it. But year after year after year, it was the same three poems that I was doing. It was a haggis, it was Tam, and it was Willie. But during all those years, I'd been learning other Burns poems. Death and Dr. Hornbook, Twa Ducks, lots of the Two a Moose, Two a Loose, lots of different poems. And I began to wonder, what's the point in doing this? You know, what's the point in me memorising all these other poems when I don't have to do them? And this was another bee in my bonnet, and which is why when I go to Burns suppers now, I try to bring in a different poem of Burns's. Like sometimes it goes down well, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's a whole load of Burns poems that you don't hear at Burns suppers, and I believe you recite a few of them as well. Is there any poem in particular or other poems that you like?
Yeah, well, I'm actually learning a poem just now, which I'm hoping to have done for the next Bachelor Club's meeting. But I'm planning on using it at the next Burns supper, all going well that I'm allowed to do it. And it's one of Robert Ferguson's, who, as we all know, was one of Burns's contemporaries. Burns loved him, he loved all his work, he was very good. And this one is called The Ode to the Gouge Spink. Now, I've only got the first verse just now, as I'm just learning it, but by this first verse, you'll see the similarities involved between Burns and Ferguson, and it's "Three fields where spring her sweets is blown, we call her verdure o'er the lawn. The gouge spink comes in new attire, the broads mang the whistling choir, that ere the sun can clear his een, we glib notes saying the simmer's green." Now, him and Burns are very alike, and in some ways they're quite frighteningly alike, because if you look at Ferguson's version of the, or Burns' version of the Cotter Saturday Night, it's very similar to a lot of stuff that Ferguson has done, and this has been commented on before. But other poets, yeah, I mean, I like William Wordsworth. I can read his poems, I like his poems. McGonagall, any kind of poetry at all, I'm interested in. A lot of, historic wise, it's I like Shakespeare, very into Shakespeare. But poetry wise, it's Ferguson, Burns. They're the two main ones that I'm concentrating on just now.
In terms of Burns, though, I mean, obviously you're reciting other poems. Do you think we could persuade you into reciting one that isn't the normal Tam O'Shanter or Holy Willie's Prayer?
Well, I'll give you Mealy and Her Dying Words, which is a story of his favourite sheep. So, as Mealy and her lambs together were I day walking on the tither, when her clout she cussed a hitch, and ere she wursled in the ditch, there groaning dying she did lie, when Hewitt he came doubting by. With glowering een and lifted hands, poor Hewitt like a statue stands. He saw her days were near hand ended, but ways my heart he couldn't amend it. He gape it wide, but nothing spak. At length poor Mealy silence sprak. O thou was lamentable face, appears to mourn my woeful case. My dying words attend to fear, and bear them to my master dear. Tell him if e'er again he keep his muckle gear, as by his sheep, oh bid him never tie them bare with wicked strings of hemp or hair, but call them out to Parker Hill and let them wander at their will. So may his flock increase and grow to scores of lambs and packs of wool. Tell him he was a master kin, and I was good to me and min, and now my dying charge of Liam, my helpless lambs, I trust him with them. And bid them save their harmless lives for dogs and tods and butchers' knives, and gie them good cow milk their fill till they be fit to fend themselves, and tent them duly e'en and morn with tates of hay and rips of corn. And may they never learn the gates of other vile van restful pecks, They stink through slaps and reed and steal at stacks of peas and stalks of kale. So Mary, like their great forebears, for money a year come through the shears. So wives will gie them bits of breed, and bairns greet for them when they're dead. My poor toot lamb, my son in air, will bid him breed him up with care. And if he lives to be a beast, he puts some havens in his breast, and tell him what I win a name, he stay content with yows at hame. And no he rin and wear his cloaks like other mensless, graceless brutes. And now my yowie, silly thing, did keep thee for a tether string. Well, may thou ne'er forget her up with any blast at moorland toot, but I keep mine to moop and mell, with sheep a credit like thyself. And now my bairns, from my last breath, I'll leave my blessing with ye baith. Next time ye think upon your mother, mind to be kind to ane another. Now honest shook dinna fail to tell my master all my tale, and bid him burn this cursed hither, and for thy pains they'll get my blather. This said, poor Mealy turned her head, and closed her in among the deed. Thank you.
Well done, well done. That was excellent. But one of the things you've been talking a little bit about poetry, but one of the things you've been doing that's a bit unusual is compiling a number of books on Burns. Can you tell us about some of these?
That's a weird story how that started. Basically, like Burns, I wanted to have my name in good black print. So I decided what's the best way to go about this. And I thought, well, probably self-publishing would be the best way to do it. Publish the books myself. But I had to find something that would be of interest to Burns lovers, to people who like Burns. So first of all, I had to look for an idea for a title for my books. One that would catch the eye and bring people in towards them. Now, I thought about this for a long time, and I couldn't come up with anything until one of my friends, Will Archer, came up with the idea, why not call it initially A Night In with a Dram and Friends? And then after it, put down what you're writing about. So that's what I decided to do. I took Will's advice, and I've all my books run along this title now, A Night In with Dram and Friends. And I decided the first one I would do would be a Burns quiz book. But I wanted to keep the first quiz book very basic so that people who didn't have a lot of information about Burns could hazard most of the answers. And at the end, as well as putting the answers in, I put a wee additive in just to tell them more about the actual answer and what it involved. And that took off very well. I was quite surprised. And that gave me the idea, well, maybe a second volume's called for here, like the Kilmarnock edition. So I said, right, let's take off a second volume. Again, that did very well. And by then I'd got bitten by the bug. Got bitten by this bug that I had to write as well as talk about Burns. So I said, what will I go now? And I said, I've always wanted to do a biography. That would be a great thing if I could do a biography in Burns. But that could take a couple of years to do. So what I decided to do was break it down. Rather than doing a biography, I would start at the beginning and work my way through a chronology of Burns's life with each of the books. And the first book is all about William Burness and Agnes Brown, his mother and father. Now, as you know, we've got quite a lot of material on William Burness himself, but there's very little about Agnes Brown to be found. Snippets here and there. Some useful information from Peter Westwood, who not related in any way, I'm sorry to say, But Peter's books were a good help in that direction. But with these books involves a lot of researching as well. So I found that tired me out, just that one wee book. It's only about that thick, not much to it. And it tired me out, and I says, I'm going to have to take a wee break between each of these. And as I say, I've been going to Burns suppers. I, I, I can't remember how many Burns suppers I've been to. And I'm listening to the Immortal Memory now. Most of the Burns suppers I've been to were in, shall we say, working men's clubs. And they would get somebody in to do a Burns supper. And I'd been researching all these speeches and going through them all. And we'd maybe be getting £60 for doing an Immortal Memory. And I remember sitting down at this one, particular one, in Coatbridge it was. And this chap got up, I'm not going to mention his name, and he started from verbatim, Len Murray's speech. Len, the great solicitor Deirdre, Len's pretty famous in the Burns scene as well for his speaking. He's a famous speech on the internet. This guy basically just downloaded the whole speech and turned up, and that was his Immortal Memory. Now, I mean right verbatim, because I remembered every bit of it. And I went, this wouldn't happen in Airdrie. You know, this is something that wouldn't happen in Airdrie because, as I say, Airdrie likes to think itself an academic club, and it is an academic club. That would get spotted straight away if somebody did that. That's why when we get someone in to do the Immortal Memory, we make sure that A, they have a bit of background knowledge about Burns. And it's not just someone who's coming along to treat the matter as a smoker's night, for want of better words. And I decided, well, there's a lot of good speeches out there. And what's the best way to learn about Burns? It's not through a chronology of his life, because anybody can do that. You can pick up any book, you'll get a chronology of Burns's life in most books. The best way to learn about him is through speeches. So I said, well, I wonder if I could get together some speeches, see what they look like, put them together, and see if I can make a book out of this. Which I did. And I sat down. It took me a wee while of collating things, writing to people, waiting for people getting back to me. I had to obviously get copyright permission. A lot of the speeches, for instance, Dr. David Purdy's speech and Cameron Goodall's. Now they don't write their speeches. These people just turn up and talk about Burns. So I put their speeches in, but I had to transcribe every individual word, and then obviously send the material off to them to have it checked. And it's amazing that when you're transcribing someone's speech, it's amazing the information you take in from that, because you're reading each line about 3 or 4 times as you're doing it. And I wanted not only the Immortal Memory in my book, that's already been done. John Kearney's already done that. He's already got the Book of Immortal Memories. I wanted to toast to the lassies. I wanted to reply to the lassies. But I also wanted to include in it any academic work at the end of the book, which I felt would be relevant to Burns. In the first book, I have basically an Immortal Memory of Eliza Riddle. And the woman tells us about her, she was very important in Burns' life. But the book turned out better than I thought it was going to turn out, and a second volume has been requested of that. And there is plenty of people out there who have got the material. But I have to be honest and say that I did get some speeches through, and when I read them, I said, that's not your speech. You know, you've either copied and pasted that and sent it. It's blatantly obvious in a lot of them. So again, I couldn't just accept speeches. I had to filter through them and check them out. and
Yeah.
make sure that they were all from the original owner. I had the copyright to publish these, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. That took up a big part of my life. In the meantime,
and you're planning another book based on your experience as a palliative nurse.
well, the next book I'm going to be working on is the palliative care that Robert Burns received on his leading up to his death. Now that just means Burns knew he was dying. There's no doubt about that. He knew weeks before he died that he was dying. And in our job, when we try and treat the symptoms that patients have when they're dying, there are 4 symptoms. There's nausea, there's agitation, there's pain, and there's breathlessness. But there is a 5th sign, which doctors miss all the time. And they're the first ones to admit that they miss it. Nurses tend to catch up on it more. And it's a thing called spiritual pain. Now, spiritual pain is not religious in any way. It's not a religious thing. What spiritual pain is a thing. I think doctors don't try to get involved too much in it because there's nothing they can do about it. Burns' spiritual pain was, he knew he was dying. That much didn't bother him too much because Burns was a deeply religious man. And Burns would assume he was going to heaven. There's no doubt about that. But spiritual pain in Burns' case, it can be anything. It could be a young mum who's dying, who has 4 children. She's not worried about the fact she's dying. What she's worried about is what's going to happen to her 4 kids. That's a terrible part. And Burns went through this. The biggest worry Burns had leading up to his death wasn't his symptoms. They weren't bothering him too much. It was what was going to happen to my kids. What was going to happen to my mother? What was going to happen to Jean? And this worried him so much that for the first time in his life, he wrote a begging letter. Now, you have to bear in mind, Burns was a very proud man, very proud. And for Burns to write a begging letter to one of his family and to Thompson asking for money, that was a big thing for him to do. But that was just shortly before he got a letter from the lawyer telling him that he could end up in the debtor's prison if he didn't pay this £5 that was owed. Now, unfortunately, Burns died before, but he didn't die penniless. That money was sent up and his debt was cleared off. But what I wanted to look at is there have been a lot of things surrounding Burns' death, and you get different versions of it depending what book you read. And I wanted to look at it from a medical point of view. There's another excellent book here. Now, it's very difficult to get your hands on it because it's from the Scottish Medical Journal, and it was published in 1982. And in it, 2 doctors, they look at Burns' illness revisited. And they talk about Burns' illness. They look at from the beginning of his life when Gilbert reported that he started having headaches. They looked, they examined his hair, the mercury content in his hair, because Maxwell was treating him for liver failure and giving him mercury to help him with that. But what they also look at is, as we know, that the cause that Burns' death was endocarditis. We know that. And most people agree in that. Even these 2 doctors agree that was the possible cause of death. But they're saying there could have been other causes of death. That the endocarditis, a lot doesn't fit with the way people have got him dying. This fact that he was conscious right to the end. And endocarditis, that wouldn't have happened. He would have went into a coma. So a lot of things are not fitting up. But that's because of all the different stories associated with them. And it all depends on which story you want to read regarding Burns. Personally, these two doctors think he may have died from a condition called brucellosis, which is a condition brought on from sheep, which is very similar condition to endocarditis. But again, that's just the research they've done. And this can be picked apart quite easily if you read it and get into the detail of it. He checked his hair for mercury, of course, to confirm if he had mercury poisoning. He had very little mercury in his hair at all. But the point that makes this flawed is it doesn't tell you where they got the hair. Now, in those days, round about the time of Nellie Kirkpatrick, it wasn't unusual for maybe Robert Burns to give a wee snippet of his hair to her and to keep it. Now, if the piece of hair they examined was his Burns as a 16-year-old, it's not going to have a lot of mercury in it. But if it was his Burns as a 37-year-old, it might well have. So we don't have a date and what age Burns was when they examined that hair. That makes that research slightly flawed because you can't go on it. But I want to look at it from the nursing point, what Jesse Lawyers did, what his wife did, how they treated him in bed. I also want to look into what Maxwell gave him, what the drugs that Maxwell used in helping him to have a peaceful death. And that's where you start to come into problems. I work with a lot of GPs, as you know, as a district nurse, and I would say to them, I've got a patient who's passing away, they've got endocarditis, you know. What would you have in your bag to treat that if you were a 17th century doctor? You know, and they would just laugh at me and go, well, laudanum, morphine's the only thing I would have in my bag to treat that. But palliative care has been going on way back into the 15th century. The monks were the first ones to start it off. And they had lots of things for treating things like breathlessness, pain, nausea, and agitation. I know I keep doing this, and I'm sorry for doing it. There's another fantastic book here. I don't know if you can see that at all.
Yep.
This is medicine in the 17th century at the time of Burns. Now, this is what the doctors would have used to treat Burns and all his symptoms. And one of the drugs, interestingly, that Burns was getting treated with was used for stomach cancer. And he actually has, there's a bottle in the Burns Museum that actually is marked stomach cancer on the bottle. It's either there or it's in the Glasgow Museum, I'm not sure. Which means that at some time Maxwell must have thought that he had stomach cancer. Which is an interesting point.
That's fascinating, David. I'm sure when you get it all compiled, everybody's going to be really interested, especially in the amount of research you're doing. We're talking about the sort of sad end of Burns's life, and we don't want to leave this episode with sadness. So I'm keen that we maybe get an opportunity for you could maybe give us a song before we finish.
Yes, I'll quite happily give you a song. How about you, Jacobites by Name?
That sounds tremendous. That would be uplifting for us.
All right, I'll take my hearing aids out. There. This is a wee tune by Robert Burns, and it's called Ye Jacobites by Name. Now, I'm going to keep the strumming down as much as possible here. Pardon me, because it will affect the recording, but we'll give it a go anyway and see how it goes. Ye Jacobites by name, lend an ear, lend an ear. Ye Jacobites by name, lend an ear. Ye Jacobites by name, your thoughts I will proclaim, your doctrines I mun blame. You will hear, your doctrines I mun blame, you will hear. What's right and what is wrong? By the law, by the law. What's right and what is wrong? By the law. What's right and what is wrong? The weak arm and the strong, the short sword and the long. For the draw, for the draw, the short sword and the long. For the draw. What makes heroic strife? Fame the fall, fame the fall. What makes heroic strife? Fame the fall. What makes heroic strife? To whet the assassin's knife and hunt a parent's life. A bloody war, bloody war, and hunt a parent's life. A bloody war. Ye Jacobites by name, lend an ear, lend an ear. Ye Jacobites by name, lend an ear. Ye Jacobites by name, your thoughts I will proclaim, your doctrines I mun blame. You will hear, you will hear, your doctrines I mun blame. You will hear. Then let your schemes alone in the state, in the state. Then let your schemes alone in the state. Then let your schemes alone adore the rising sun and leave a man undone to his fate, to his fate, and leave a man undone to his fate. Jacobites by name, London here, London here. Ye Jacobites by name, London here. Ye Jacobites by name, your thoughts I will proclaim, your doctrines I will blame. You will hear, you will hear, your doctrines I will blame. You will hear. Thank you very much. It's just that I was, if it's possible, if I could just make a wee announcement, if anybody would like to contribute to the Burns speeches in Volume 2, please don't hesitate to send your speech on to me at westy1958 at hotmail.co.uk. I will not refuse any speeches and all will be entered. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, that was absolutely great. It's nice to hear an upbeat song, but we're fair away with that T-shirt you're wearing. You need to tell us about that.
Yes, this is a T-shirt that my wife made for me. She got this it's called a cricket machine. And you just download anything you want off the internet and you can superimpose any writing on it you want and just burn it onto your T-shirts. So I've got a few Burns T-shirts made up like this. I've got a few with a night out with a Drammen French made as well for advertising when I go on my cruise to America next year. That's about the way that is.
And what's your wife's name?
Oh, Pat, it's her name.
Very good. So I think we've been introduced now to the whole family, and we've finished off with, as Jim says, an upbeat song, which is great. So all that leaves me to say is thank you very much, David, for giving us your time to tell us about your life with Robert Burns. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I've thoroughly enjoyed that. That was really good. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at the Bachelor's Night in July. Thanks, David.